First of all, welcome to all of you. I'd like to uh, offer a special welcome to any new members who are joining us for the first time. We welcome you as new members and hope you will remain as members for a long time to come. Um, a few announcements. We are now taking orders for Bayreuth tickets for the 2026 season. For those of you who wish to order tickets through the Society, we are planning to order tickets for the Ring, Rienzi, Parsifal, and Der Fliegende Holländer for the performances from August 12th through the 20th. If you're interested, you send a $100 deposit payable to the Wagner Society of Northern California in care of my home address, which is listed in an email I sent out to everybody. But if you have any questions, please contact me individually. The deadline for receipt of the deposit is October 12th. I sent out an email to all members. If you cannot find it or have any questions, please contact me. But the deadline is October 12th. We also have an upcoming election, not only national and statewide election, but a Wagner Society election coming up in November. And soon I will be putting out a call for nominations. We have two board positions which are actually going to be open due to various circumstances. And so if you have any desire to serve on the board, this is your chance because you won't be running against any incumbent, and it's a pretty much easier way to get elected. We certainly welcome anybody and everybody who might be interested. You do not need to be a Wagner expert. You don't need to know a thing about Wagner in order to satisfactorily serve on our board. We welcome people with any sort of office-based skills or particularly web-based skills. Web page development is a big need of ours right now. So if you happen to have knowledge of that, please come forward. If you have knowledge of that, but don't have the time to serve on the board or desire to serve on the board, but are willing to help out behind the scenes, we would welcome that also. Anybody who's willing to help us for anything, believe me, we welcome you with open arms. Also, just a reminder, we have our 40th anniversary fundraising still going on. We are close to hitting our goal of raising $40,000 this year, but we still are falling a bit short, and we would like to be able to hit that goal before the end of the year. So you can go online and donate to our 40th anniversary fund. That would be very much appreciated. Also, we will be sending out a call for renewal of membership soon. We hope that you will all renew, because without membership, we are really nothing. The majority of our income is from membership dues, and we really appreciate your continued membership, your support, and any additional donations. Also, before I forget, during the course of the talk, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom to lodge your questions. Did you want to put up the slide for our future events, Emma?
Okay.
Let me talk about future events. Coming up on Saturday, October 18th, we have Paul Schofield, who will be speaking about Parsifal as the fifth opera of the Ring. That'll be a Zoom session. On Saturday, November 1st, we will have a live in-person session at the Jewish Community Center at 1 o'clock. Professor Thomas Gray will be talking about sacred spaces in Parsifal. That same evening, the San Francisco Opera Orchestra will be putting on a performance of Beethoven's Symphony. And the following day, November 2nd, will be a Parsifal performance. So for you out-of-towners, that would be a great weekend to come into town to get not only a Wagner Society meeting, but a concert and a Parsifal performance at the same time. On Saturday, December 6th, we will have our annual Cosima Wagner birthday party, this year featuring the famous German Helden tenor Klaus Florian Vogt, who will be serenading us in private at the Marines Memorial Center in downtown San Francisco, accompanied by our Bayreuth stipendiate Yang Lin. On Saturday, January 24th at 1 o'clock, we will have another live meeting at the Jewish Community Center featuring Professor Robert Cox from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, who is a voice teacher, and will be talking to us about specifics about teaching voice, particularly as it relates to Wagner. On Saturday, February 14th at 1 o'clock, we will have a Zoom session featuring Peter Phillips, who happens to be the president of the Wagner Society of New York, and also is an author of a book that he co-authored with tenor Stephen Gould, who unfortunately has passed away, but many of you may know him from his performances at Bayreuth. And they jointly wrote a book entitled Performing Wagner, A Singer's Perspective on the Major Tenor Roles. He will be discussing that book. On Saturday, March 28th at 1 o'clock, we will have another live, Peter Phillips will be a Zoom session on the 14th. March 28th at 1 o'clock, we will have a live meeting at the Jewish Community Center featuring composer and musician Leo Aylar, who spoke to us last year about the leitmotifs in the ring, and he'll be continuing on similar topics in March. April 25th, at 1 o'clock Saturday, we will have a Zoom session featuring Erica Miner, who will be talking to us about Wagner and Berlioz. In May of next year, we'll have our Richard Wagner party. And on June 6th of next year, we'll have another Zoom session featuring tenor Holden Madagami, who will be talking to us about the transformation of Mima. And you will find out more about the significance of that title as we get closer to the date. So that's the end of the announcements. I'd like to use this moment now to move on to our speaker. We are thrilled to have as our guest speaker today, Nicolas Krusek, who is giving us a talk, part 2 of his lecture on Wagner and Nietzsche. Nicolas Krusek is a speaker and educator with 20 years of experience teaching music, literature, and history. He studied orchestral conducting at the Janáček Academy of Music and Performing Arts in Brno in the Czech Republic, and historical musicology at the University of British Columbia. Holder of a Distinguished Toastmaster designation, Nicolas has been a master of ceremonies at conferences and concerts, and he has given educational talks to audiences at opera performances, symphony concerts, and philosophy conferences. He has taught courses for UBC Continuing Studies and the SFU Liberal Arts and Plus 55 program. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Nicolas Krusek for part 2 of his talk on Wagner and Nietzsche. Nicolas?
Thank you very much, Andy. It's great to be back, to see all of you, and to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Wagner and Nietzsche. And since it's been quite a few weeks since part 1 of this series, I'd like to begin with just a little bit of review of some of the intellectual background and some of the biographical background before we plunge into some new material. So the relationship between these two giants has to be understood against the background of the major intellectual currents of the 19th century. And in particular, there were two philosophers who had a very big influence on both Wagner and Nietzsche. And I'd just like to quickly review some of their ideas. We're talking specifically about Ludwig Feuerbach and Arthur Schopenhauer. So Ludwig Feuerbach was a philosopher who had a very big influence on Wagner during the 1840s, during the period when Wagner composed Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, and when he was beginning to embark on writing the prose scenario and the libretto of what would eventually become the Ring of the Nibelung. And one central idea of Feuerbach's that we want to remind ourselves of is this idea of the anthropological critique of Christianity. So Feuerbach was a materialist philosopher. He was an atheist philosopher. And one of his central ideas is this notion that all of the various concepts and principles that people accept in religion are really just projections of aspects of humanity itself. So, for example, humanity's ideas about God, about the deity, are really just aspects of humanity's own nature, aspects of humanity as a species projected onto some fictional being. Likewise, humanity's ideas about the afterlife, about immortality, are basically an abstraction of all the things that people think are good and positive in life, enjoyment, relaxation, but taking away all the negatives, taking away pain and suffering, and so on. And then Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, who was very important. Wagner discovered Schopenhauer sometime in the fall of 1854, when he just completed composing the music for Das Rheingold and was beginning to embark upon writing the music for Die Walküre. Schopenhauer, his central idea, which he essentially took over from Immanuel Kant, was the idea that we have to make a distinction between reality as we perceive it, reality as it appears to us, which is what Schopenhauer called the world as representation. That's the reality that's constructed by our senses and by our thinking mind, which is not the real reality. It is just a construct of our senses and our mind. So for Schopenhauer, that's the world as representation. But then underlying that, there's a real reality, which according to Kant, we can't know very much about. But according to Schopenhauer, the real reality underlying what we perceive and what we think about is what Schopenhauer calls the will. Okay, so Schopenhauer makes a distinction between the world as representation, which is merely appearance, in which we appear to be separate individual beings, in which we perceive certain objects and certain other people, animals, etc. But underlying all of this is the world as will, it's this indivisible, inseparable one, this inseparable element. And Schopenhauer had some very particular ideas about the world as will, that it's irrational, blind, and ultimately destructive, that it's this malevolent force that underlies and permeates everything. And when people talk about Schopenhauer and describe Schopenhauer as a pessimist, when people say that Schopenhauer was a pessimistic philosopher, a lot of that has to do with his idea that existence as such is basically bad. Existence is basically evil because there's this irrational force underlying everything. For Schopenhauer, this explains all the pain, all the evil, all the suffering in the world. Why? When you look at the animal kingdom, you see one animal devouring another animal. In the human world, you see one person tyrannizing or abusing or harming other human beings. So for Schopenhauer, this was an explanation for everything that exists. And we'll see how this influenced some of Wagner's later ideas. Okay, so Feuerbach and Schopenhauer, those are the two important philosophers here. And just to quickly summarize some of the biographical background. So Wagner was heavily influenced by Feuerbach through the 1840s. Then he was much more influenced by Schopenhauer in later years, but Feuerbach still remained very much in the background. And indeed, you can see influence of Feuerbach's ideas even on Wagner's later works like Tristan and Isolde, the Master Singers of Nuremberg, and Parsifal. And if we have time, we might touch on some of those points later on. Nietzsche was quite a bit younger than Wagner. He was 31 years younger than Wagner. Indeed, Wagner was born in 1813, the same year that Nietzsche's father was born. And Nietzsche's intellectual background was very different. He grew up in a very pious, very devout Lutheran family. Nietzsche's father had been a Lutheran minister. Both of his grandfathers had been Lutheran ministers, and his mother and sister were very, very devout women. At some point in his late teens, Nietzsche seems to have lost his religious faith. And it was around that time when he was attending university in Bonn and then in Leipzig, when he was attending university, that Nietzsche lost his religious faith. And shortly around there, he discovered the philosophy of Schopenhauer. probably sometime when he was around the age of 20. He discovered Schopenhauer, and that became one of the dominant philosophical influences on him in the next couple of years. So where we ended last time was with the initial meeting between Wagner and Nietzsche and some of the earlier stages of their relationship. The first meeting between these two men was in the fall of 1868. Specifically, it was in November of 1868. Now, by that time, Wagner had completed and successfully premiered Tristan and Isolde and Die Meistersinger, and was about to embark on the completion of The Ring of the Nibelung, the completion of the third act of Siegfried and all of Götterdämmerung in the years to come. And it's worth bearing in mind that Wagner, at this point, was arguably the most famous composer in Germany and one of the most famous composers in Europe. So he was a major international celebrity, feted by heads of state like King Ludwig of Bavaria, who paid for performances of many and premieres of many of Wagner's operas. Nietzsche, at this time, when he met Wagner, was a relatively unknown young man. He was still in university. In the next year, he was going to be a professor of philology at Basel University. And so Nietzsche had encountered Wagner's music some years earlier, while he was still a young university student. He happened to come across a piano arrangement of the prelude to Tristan and Isolde and was immediately taken with Wagner's music and would remain a partisan of Wagner's music for many years to come. And what particularly brought these two men together, besides their shared enthusiasm for music, and bear in mind that Nietzsche himself was a musician. He played the piano, he sang, he composed songs and piano music. So aside from their shared interest in music, Wagner and Nietzsche were both at that time of the philosophy of Schopenhauer. And if you think back to that letter, which Nietzsche wrote to his closest friend about his first meeting with Wagner, he talks about how, oh, and I was so moved by how warmly he speaks about our master Schopenhauer. So that's a little bit of the background here. We also talked a little bit last time about the relationship between Nietzsche and the Wagners, Richard and Cosima and their children. So while Nietzsche was a professor at Basel University, Wagner and Cosima and their children were living at Tribschen, not too far away, something like 60 miles away. So Nietzsche was a frequent visitor at the Wagner household during these 3 or 4 years, from about 1868 to early 1872. He would frequently spend his holidays with the Wagner, do their Christmas shopping. So he was a regular fixture within the Wagner household. He had his own room. He and Wagner would have long, long conversations about art, music, philosophy, religion, various other topics. What we want to do today is the following. First of all, we want to talk about the gradual dissolution of their friendship, the gradual breaking up of their friendship, and what are some of the possible reasons, either biographical reasons or intellectual reasons, for this gradual cooling of the relationship between them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of Nietzsche's published attacks against Wagner in the late 70s and into the 1880s, as well as some of Wagner's responses to these attacks. I want to begin by just giving you a little bit of a sample of the beginning and the end of this gradually declining relationship. And I think a good starting point here is with Nietzsche's first published book. Nietzsche's first published book was called The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. It was published at the beginning of 1872, so Nietzsche is not yet 30 years old. And this book was very much the product of long discussions and conversations that he had with Wagner. So the influence of Wagner on this book is absolutely unmistakable and was recognized by many contemporaries at the time. The book was, not surprisingly, dedicated to Wagner, and it actually begins with a preface addressed to Wagner himself. And I'd actually like to begin by reading you a little bit of Nietzsche's preface, the original preface to this book, where he addresses Wagner directly. I'll just read the first paragraph of this to give you an idea. in order to keep far away from me all possible disturbances, agitation, and misunderstandings which the assembly of ideas in this piece of writing will bring about on account of the peculiar characteristic of our aesthetic public, and also to be capable of writing a word of introduction to the book with the same contemplative joy which marks every page, the crystallization of good inspirational hours, I am imagining the look with which you, my esteemed friend, will receive this work. How you, perhaps after an evening stroll in the winter snow, look at the unbound Prometheus on the title page, read my name, and are immediately convinced that, no matter what this text consists of, the writer has something serious and urgent to say, and that in addition, in everything which he composed, he was conversing with you, as with someone present, and could only write down what was appropriate to such a presence. Let me pick out a few interesting points in this opening paragraph. First of all, that sentence, the crystallization of good inspirational hours. Here Nietzsche is referring to his long conversations with Wagner about Greek culture, Greek tragedy, the nature of art, the nature of the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, etc. So he addresses Wagner, my esteemed friend, I'm imagining the look with which you will receive this work. Nietzsche, of course, had sent Wagner a copy of this book, which he dedicated to him. And then he talks about how he wrote the book as if he were conversing with you. He wrote this book as if he were imagining a conversation with Wagner, that he had a conversation with Wagner in mind. Okay, so this book came out early in 1872. Fast forward now 14 years, 1886. Wagner by now is deceased, and Nietzsche comes out with a new edition of this book, a revised edition of this book, in which he added a new preface, which Nietzsche called an attempt at a self-criticism. An attempt at a self-criticism. And here is the beginning. So this is Nietzsche writing about the birth of tragedy 14 years after the book's initial publication. Let me say again, today for me it is an impossible book. I call it something poorly written, ponderous, painful, with fantastic and confused imagery, here and there so saccharine it is effeminate, uneven in tempo, without any impulse for logical clarity, extremely self-confident and thus dispensing with evidence, even distrustful of the relevance of evidence. Like a book for the initiated, like music for those baptized in music, those who are bound together from the start in secret and esoteric aesthetic experiences, a sign recognized among artistic blood relations, an arrogant and rhapsodic book which right from the start hermetically sealed itself off from the profane vulgarity of the intelligentsia, even more than from the people. But a book which, as its effect proved and continues to prove, must also understand enough of this issue to search out its fellow rhapsodists and tempt them to seek new secret paths and dancing grounds, etc., etc. So you get the idea that Nietzsche is dissatisfied with and trying to separate himself from the very first product of his imagination. Okay, so that's Nietzsche's later response to his first book. He's deliberately trying to distance himself from this book, which had clearly been influenced by Wagner and clearly influenced by Schopenhauer as well. Now, let me say just a quick word about one key idea in this book, Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy. One of the central ideas of this book, which was something relatively new and interesting at the time, is the distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian and the Dionysian. And these, according to Nietzsche, these were two elements in ancient Greek culture. And to understand how new this was in the history of studies of Greek culture, we need to remember that the older idea of the ancient Greeks, particularly the 18th century idea of people like Goethe and other earlier thinkers, philosophers, and cultural figures, was this view of the Greeks as these very cheerful, very positive people. And over the course of the 19th century, there was more of an understanding and more of an appreciation that there was a darker side to Greek culture and to the Greek sense of life. And so the way Nietzsche lays out the argument is that the Greek Apollonian spirit is the spirit Essentially, it's the spirit of poetry and the visual arts. It's the spirit that it's tied to it's tied to Schopenhauer's idea of the world as representation, where we're all separate beings, where we understand each other as individuals, whereas the Dionysian element is darker and more dangerous and more malevolent. It's in a way it corresponds more closely to Schopenhauer's idea of the will as something, and the Dionysian element is more closely associated in Nietzsche's mind with music as opposed to poetry and the plastic arts. So there's a heavy influence of Schopenhauer here. It's very, very clear how Nietzsche's discussions with Wagner would have given rise to this particular book. Now, a couple of things happened in the early 1870s which led to a gradual cooling off of the relationship between Wagner and Nietzsche. One was that the Wagners actually left Tribschen and eventually settled in Bayreuth sometime in the early 1870s. So this is important because there was a greater distance now, a greater geographical distance between Nietzsche on the one hand and Richard and Cosima on the other hand. It's worth bearing in mind, I think this will be well known to this audience, that Wagner was a very powerful, very domineering sort of personality that once you got caught up in his orbit, it was very difficult to assert yourself and to have ideas and opinions of your own. So having a greater distance from the Wagners meant that Nietzsche was thinking more on his own, he was beginning to discover ways in which he disagreed with Wagner and disagreed with the whole, as he came to see it, the whole Bayreuth circle. Specifically, things that Nietzsche came to disagree with were Wagner's extreme nationalism, the extreme German nationalism, the Francophobia, the anti-Semitism. I would say especially the last of these. Anti-Semitism was something that became extremely loathsome to Nietzsche as the years went on. In fact, Nietzsche eventually broke off relations with his sister Elizabeth when she married a notorious anti-Semite in the early 1880s. So there were lots of causes for Nietzsche's gradual separation from Wagner's ideas, his ideals, his personality. Now, Nietzsche did attend the first Bayreuth Ring cycle in August of 1876. And you can see from Nietzsche's letters to his sister and to other friends that he was really horrified by the whole experience. And there were several reasons. Now, an idea that we're going to keep coming back to is that Nietzsche, throughout his adult life, was plagued with atrocious ill health, migraine headaches, painful gastrointestinal illnesses, very poor eyesight, verging on blindness for long stretches of time. So just for Nietzsche, just physically sitting through the operas of The Ring of the Nibelung was a very trying experience. But also the whole Bayreuth milieu. I mean, here Wagner was hobnobbing with cultural and intellectual elites, with major heads of state. And Nietzsche, who had been such an intimate friend of the Wagners earlier years, was now shunted off to the side. He was no longer important. He was no longer as intimate with the Wagners. And here he was surrounded by all these Philistines, as Nietzsche saw them, all these German nationalists, these anti-Semites, these people that he didn't care for. So the whole Bayreuth experience was a very bad one for Nietzsche. And one way that I'd like to illustrate this is by reading you a little bit from one of Nietzsche's untimely meditations. These are a series of long essays that Nietzsche wrote between 1873 and 1876. The last of the untimely meditations is actually called Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. And the interesting thing, so Nietzsche presumably agreed to write this particular essay, or he agreed with Wagner that he would write the essay. And I suspect that once Nietzsche started writing this essay, he probably thought, oh, brother, I don't really want to write this bloody thing. But he forced himself to go through with it. It's a strange essay because Nietzsche actually doesn't have a lot to say about Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. He's very elliptical. He kind of dances around the issue. Anyway, let's just read a little bit of this. Is one paragraph sort of earlier on the essay. And what's interesting is how little Nietzsche actually says about his alleged subject here. Okay, when on that dismal and cloudy day in May 1872, after the foundation stone had been laid on the height of Bayreuth, amid torrents of rain, And while Wagner was driving back to the town with a small party of us, he was exceptionally silent. And there was that indescribable look in his eyes as of one who has turned his gaze deeply inwards. The day happened to be the first of his 60th year, and his whole past now appeared as but a long preparation for this great moment. It is almost a recognized fact that in times of exceptional danger, or at all decisive and culminating points in their lives, men see the remotest and most recent events of their career with singular vividness, and in one rapid inward glance obtain a sort of panorama of a whole span of years in which every event is faithfully depicted. What, for instance, must Alexander the Great have seen in that instance when he caused Asia and Europe to be drunk out of the same goblet? But what went on through Wagner's mind on that day, how he became what he is, and what he will be, we can only imagine who are nearest to him, and can follow him up to a certain point in his self-examination. But through his eyes alone, it is possible for us to understand his grand work, and by the help of this understanding, vouch for its fruitfulness. Okay, so the essay continues for about 50 or 60 pages in this vein. You can see Nietzsche, he's saying a lot, but he's not really telling us very much about Wagner or about Bayreuth. That's really what the essay is about. So the essay was written by a man who had been a devout follower of the Wagner cause, but was progressively becoming disenchanted with the great man. Okay, in a moment, we're going to turn to some of Nietzsche's specific criticisms of Wagner and some of Wagner's responses to that. Before that, I want to do two things very quickly. I want to tell you a brief story, which many of you have probably heard or come across, and I think it's worth recounting. This is very often, it's a story that's very often offered as an explanation for the break in the friendship between Wagner and Nietzsche. And that involves a certain doctor in Switzerland named Otto Eiser. So in 1877, Nietzsche went to see this Swiss doctor, this Dr. Otto Eiser, for his problems with his eyes, his painful eye condition, which left him blind, unable to read, unable to see very often for days on end. Now, apparently, this particular doctor was an enthusiastic admirer of Wagner's music. That's important. Keep that in mind. Anyway, so this doctor did a thorough physical examination of Nietzsche, including his eyesight, and in an egregious breach of medical ethics, the doctor actually wrote to Wagner. He knew about the friendship between the composer and the philologist. He wrote to Wagner to tell him about his examination of Nietzsche and his sort of tentative prognosis. And Wagner, in an equally egregious breach of decorum, wrote back. Now, it's important to bear in mind that in the 19th century, there was a widespread prejudice that blindness, particularly in young men, was caused or could be caused by excessive masturbation. And so Wagner, having this paternal concern and solicitude for Nietzsche, remember that after all, Nietzsche was 31 years younger than Wagner. So Wagner actually wrote to the doctor, advising him and saying, you have to tell Nietzsche to stop this abhorrent practice, tell him to settle down, find a wife, etc., etc. Now, there are different versions of this story, but the gist of it is that somehow Nietzsche found out about this correspondence between the doctor and Wagner. It's possible that either Wagner's secretary, Volkswagen, might have glimpsed at the letter and leaked it to some friends in Bayreuth, or possibly Nietzsche might have heard about it after the fact from the doctor himself. At any rate, this became fodder for gossip among the Bayreuth crowd. So lots of people found out about this, about Nietzsche's eye problems, the diagnosis, Wagner's opinion of it. And to this day, many people present this as a reason for the break between the two men. At the end of the last session, someone asked me a question about Brian McGee's book on Wagner, the Tristan Court, Wagner and Philosophy. I said at the time that I had strongly mixed views of the book. It has some good stuff in it. So Brian McGee himself was a Schopenhauer scholar. He has lots of good things to say about Schopenhauer. He totally neglects Feuerbach, unfortunately. And a lot of what he says about Nietzsche, I think, is a little bit misguided. And I think McGee has a tendency to make too much of a big deal of this particular story, this whole blindness, masturbation story. I think there are so many more reasons for the gradual worsening of the relationship between Wagner and Nietzsche. Now, this particular incident, it may have been a minor factor, but I think it's been blown out of proportion and too much has been made out of it. Nonetheless, because it's such a frequently recounted and repeated story, I thought it was worthwhile to, at the very least, bring it up and address it. Now, with that, I'd like to pause for a few moments and ask if there are any questions or comments before we go on to the next part of the presentation. So Andy, perhaps you could unmute, and if there are any questions or comments in the chat, you could read them out. Okay, if Andy's not there, then never mind. We'll turn to that later on. In that case, let's continue on and go on to the next portion, which is, as I said, Nietzsche's published attacks on Wagner and Wagner's response to these. And then hopefully in a couple of minutes we can return and take up some questions from you, the viewers. Okay, you're back. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Right, I just had a hard time. I had a hard time finding the button to unmute myself. So yeah, there are actually a couple of questions.
Okay.
Deborah Marion has two questions. Weren't some of Schopenhauer's ideas the opposite of Wagner's? I read that Schopenhauer never married and believed the opposite of what Wagner wrote about in Tristan und Isolde, where where there is one love forever. And then her other question was, I didn't know that Wagner and Nietzsche fell out. Was Wagner aligned with Nietzsche's idea of the superhuman?
Okay, so Wagner's view of Nietzsche's philosophy is something we'll take up a little bit later on, but I do want to address the point about Schopenhauer. So yeah, even though Wagner was in many ways a loyal disciple of Schopenhauer, he did disagree with Schopenhauer on some points. The most important of which is their respective views of romantic love, or their respective views of human sexuality. So Schopenhauer had a very negative view of romantic love and sexuality. No, Schopenhauer himself was never married. In fact, Schopenhauer was a notorious misogynist. If any of you have ever read Schopenhauer's essay on women, my God, it's awful. It's the most misogynistic, most horrific thing you could ever read. So we know that Schopenhauer had various love affairs or various relationships with women, all of which ended very badly. Anyway, the point is Schopenhauer had a very negative view of women, of romantic love, and of human sexuality as such. More specifically, Schopenhauer viewed sexual love as the strongest aspect, one of the strongest aspects connecting us to the will, or one of the strongest aspects where the will manifests itself in us. In fact, Schopenhauer, in one of his, I think it might even be in his chief work, The World is Will and Representation, Schopenhauer argues that the center of the will in human beings, the focus of the will is actually in the region of the genitals. So Schopenhauer believed that sexual attractions, sexual feelings are very negative and very destructive. Whereas, of course, for Wagner, love, romantic love, sexual love is closely connected with redemption. And that's something we see even in Wagner's earlier operas. But yes, in Tristan and Isolde, Wagner clearly has a very positive view of romantic love and the union between the spiritual union between the man and the woman. So that's a good question. That's definitely a point where Wagner and Schopenhauer were in strong disagreement. And Andy, was there another question, or were those the only ones so far?
There is another question
Okay, Emma, go ahead and read it out.
from Deborah Marion. I didn't know Wagner and Nietzsche fell out. Was Wagner, excuse me, aligned with Nietzsche's idea of the superhuman?
Okay, yeah, Andy already read out that question. Well, okay, I'll address that very briefly. The short answer is now. First of all, Nietzsche's idea of the superhuman, or the Übermensch, the overman, was first articulated in the book "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," which Nietzsche wrote around the time that Wagner died. Remember, Wagner died in Venice in February of 1883. That was around the time when Nietzsche was engaged on writing part one of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So strictly speaking, Wagner would not have known about Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch because he died before that book was published. However, I can say with absolute certainty that Wagner would have disagreed with that whole idea, the whole idea of the. And I'm going to return to this a little bit later on when we talk about Parsifal and some of the ideas in Parsifal and Nietzsche's response to them. Okay, let's return now to Nietzsche's attacks on Wagner and Wagner's response to them. So we're going to look at a few excerpts from these two books, Human All Too Human and The Gay Science. These are the books that Nietzsche wrote after he basically broken with Wagner. So after the Bayreuth Festival, I think the last time that Nietzsche and Wagner actually saw each other was in Italy in 1877, so the year after the Bayreuth Ring premiere. They saw each other, I think, in Sorrento, and then after that they had no direct contact, no direct communication. So that was the period during which these books were written, between 1878 and 1882. And I'm just going to jump around a little bit and look at a few passages. So all of these things that Nietzsche is writing while Wagner is still alive, that's important to bear in mind. First of all, let's look at this very brief discussion of so-called endless melody. Wagner's idea of endless melody. So Nietzsche's talk, he says, gradually one loses one's footing and one ultimately abandons oneself to the mercy or fury of the elements. One has to swim. In the solemn or fiery swinging movement, first slow and then quick, of old music, one had to do something quite different. One had to dance. The measure which was required for this and the control of certain balanced degrees of time and energy forced the soul of the listener to continual sobriety of thought. Upon the counterplay of the cooler currents of air which came from this sobriety and from the warmer breath of enthusiasm, the charm of all good music rested. Richard Wagner wanted another kind of movement. He overthrew the physiological first principle of all music before his time. It was no longer a matter of walking or dancing. We must swim. We must hover. This perhaps decides the whole matter, etc. Now, of course, here Nietzsche is bringing up something which comes up again and again in Wagner criticism, not only from the composer's time, but even long after, which is the idea that Wagner's music has this intoxicating quality where we lose our bearings, lose our sense of reality, lose our sense of ourselves, etc. That Wagner's music has this narcotic effect on the listener. That's what Nietzsche is getting at here. I'm actually going to skip over this quote. This is not super important. Oh, I will read a little bit of this here. So here Nietzsche is talking about how music very often absorbs elements that come earlier in the culture. So he talks about how Handel's music reflects the spirit of Martin Luther, how Mozart's music is sort of a reflection of the epoch of Louis XIV, how Beethoven and Rossini's music is an expression of the 18th century. And now Nietzsche continues towards the bottom here of this clip. Even our last form of music, despite its prevalence and its will to prevail, has perhaps only a short time to live, for it sprouted from a soil which was in the throes of a rapid subsidence, of a culture which will soon be submerged. A certain Catholicism of feeling and a predilection for some ancient indigenous so-called national ideals and eccentricities was its first condition. Wagner's appropriation of old sagas and songs, in which scholarly prejudice taught us to see something German par excellence, now we laugh at it all. The resurrection of these Scandinavian monsters with a thirst for ecstatic sensuality and spiritualization, the whole of this taking and giving on Wagner's part in the matter of subjects, characters, passions, and nerves, would also give unmistakable expression to the spirit of his music, provided that this music, like any other, did not know how to speak about itself save ambiguously, for musica is a woman. Okay, so remember, again, Nietzsche is writing all of this while Wagner is still alive. Let's read the last little bit of this. Okay, I'll read a little bit of this. So this is a common complaint against Wagner's music, which is that Wagner's music gives rise to physiological or physical disturbances. So let's start at the top here. With all of this, I do not wish to imply that I regard this music as healthy, and least of all in those places where it speaks of Wagner himself. My objections to Wagner's music are physiological objections. Why should I therefore begin by clothing them in aesthetic formulae? Aesthetic is indeed nothing more than applied physiology. Okay, skipping down a little bit. Let's go on to this sentence. Not my stomach, my heart, my circulation also protest. Are not my intestines also troubled? Do I not become hoarse unawares? In order to listen to Wagner, I require Giraudel's pastilles. That was a type of cough medicine at the time. And later on, at the bottom of the page, Nietzsche goes on to criticize the fact that Wagner was fundamentally a man of the theater. Nietzsche goes on to say that the theater is mob art par excellence. My soul has the deepest scorn felt by every artist today. With a stage success, a man sinks to such an extent in my esteem as to drop out of sight. Failure in this quarter makes me prick up my ears, makes me begin to pay attention. And then he goes on to say that Wagner was essentially a man of the stage, an actor, the most enthusiastic mimomaniac that has perhaps existed on earth, even as a musician, etc. Okay, let's now look at Wagner's response to all of this. And many of these short clips that we're going to look at come from Cosima Wagner's diaries. These are copious diaries in two thick volumes, and I say thick volumes, about 1,000 pages each in the English translation. During the period of Cosima's marriage to Wagner, so 1869 till Wagner's death in 1883. And by the way, if you're interested in looking up these clips for yourselves, I got these clips from a really terrific website called Wagnerheim.com. Wagnerheim.com. It's a website that has a very detailed analysis of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung through the lens and framework of Feuerbach's influence on Wagner's ideas. But as an appendix, the website includes some quotations from Feuerbach, which strongly influenced Wagner, as well as some quotations from Wagner, which we're going to look at now, which betray the influence of Feuerbach or which shows some connection with Schopenhauer and other thinkers. So a very, very useful resource that I warmly recommend. Let's look at this first. The first few clips here come from the year 1878, so shortly after the break between Wagner and Nietzsche. Here's the first quote. And so this is Cosima writing in her diary. At noon, arrival of a new book by friend Nietzsche, presumably human, all too human. Feelings of apprehension after a short glance through it. Richard feels he would be doing the author a favor for which the latter would one day thank him if he did not read it. It seems to me to contain much inner rage and sullenness, and Richard laughs heartily when I say that Voltaire, here so acclaimed, would less than any other man have understood the birth of tragedy. Quick footnote, Nietzsche's Human, All Too Human actually begins with a dedication to Voltaire. It was published around the time of the 100th anniversary of Voltaire's death. And of course, Wagner, being a strong Francophobe, would have, I think, had an interesting and amusing reaction to Nietzsche's dedication of this book to the great French writer and thinker. Next clip. Richard reads some of Nietzsche's latest book and is astonished by its pretentious ordinariness. I remark that to judge by this latest book, Nietzsche's early ones were just reflections of something else. They did not come from within. Now, that's particularly interesting when you consider that the birth of tragedy and the early untimely meditations were heavily influenced by Nietzsche's conversations with Wagner and his relationship with Wagner. So I think Richard and Cosima are picking up on something here. Nietzsche is developing a mind of his own. He's developing his own ideas, and they clearly object to this. Next quote. Through this, Richard comes to Nietzsche, of whom he says, that bad person has taken everything from me, even the weapons with which he now attacks me. How sad that he should be so perverse, so clever, yet at the same time so shallow. And one more clip on this page. Yesterday, before we began to play cards, the vision of Nietzsche's behavior rose once more in his mind. Referring to Richard. He said, Nietzsche wrote his thoughts out of season, thus acknowledging that what he admires does not belong in our time, but goes beyond it. And now he uses the fact that my enterprise is out of season to criticize it. Can one imagine anything worse than that? Okay, now the next clip is not from Cosima's diaries. It's actually from a letter from Wagner to a mutual friend named Franz Overbeck, who knew both Wagner and Nietzsche. This letter was written towards the end of 1879, and it shows that even after Nietzsche had begun attacking Wagner in print, Wagner still has a certain paternal solicitude for the younger man. So keep that in mind. Here's this slightly longer quote. How could I ever forget this friend of mine, Nietzsche, who was driven from me so forcefully? Although I constantly had the feeling that, at the time of his association with me, Nietzsche's life was ruled by a mental spasm, and although it was bound to strike me as odd that this spasm could have produced so spiritually radiant and heartwarming a fire as was manifest in him to the astonishment of all, and although finally the ultimate decision which he reached in the inner development of his life filled me with the utmost horror when I saw how intolerable a pressure that spasm was finally causing him, I must no doubt also admit that in the case of so powerful a psychic process, it is simply not possible to argue along moral lines, and that one's only response can be a shocked silence. It saddens me, however, to be so completely excluded from any part in Nietzsche's life and difficulties. Would it be indiscreet of me to ask you to send me news of our friend? I was particularly anxious to beg this favor of you. Okay, so that's an excerpt from a letter from Wagner to Franz Overbeck, who was friends with both Wagner and Nietzsche. Here's one last quote, which is kind of interesting. This is returning now to Cosima's diaries. This is, again, towards the end of 1879. Yesterday evening, he read to me some passages from poor Nietzsche's new book, presumably Daybreak, and E. Schur's saying about nihilism, a nauseating nihilism came into his mind. To feel nothing but scorn for such a noble and compelling figure as Jesus Christ, Richard exclaims indignantly. He continues with it today and reads several more things about Faust, for instance, which are horrifying. So, in this particular book, Daybreak, Nietzsche has some critical comments about Goethe's Faust, which, of course, every German regarded as the monument, the epitome of German literature. Keep that in mind because I'm going to return to this point a little bit later on. Okay, I'm going to skip over these last few quotations. I think you get the idea here. And what I'd like to do now, before we go on and talk about, what I'd like to talk about next is Schopenhauer's morality, how that influenced Parsifal, and how Nietzsche responded to that, the influence of Schopenhauer's morality, and also the influence of Christianity in particular on Parsifal. Let me just pause for another moment and ask if there are any questions in the chat or in the Q&A.
The only question Deborah Marion is asking, where can one get a copy of Cosima's diaries? I'll give my own answer and you can give yours also. To my knowledge, it's out of print, and so it's probably only available used from a used bookstore, perhaps Amazon or something like that. Do you have any idea? Do you have any idea?
So I have both volumes of Cosima's diaries, and I got them from a used bookstore here in the Vancouver area. I don't know where else one would get them. Yeah, possibly it might be available from Amazon or Abe Books or eBay or some online retailer. That's possible. It's also possible that the Cosima's diaries might be available on the Internet Archive. It's possible that they've been digitized and that you might be able to access them through the Internet Archive, in which case you may have to set up an account, in which case you'd need an email address and a password to log in. But that's also something to look into. The Internet Archive, archive.org. I've actually found a lot of very interesting books that way, books that have been scanned and digitized and made available online. So that I hope that helps. That's also worth looking into. Okay, let's talk. Yes, was there anything else?
That's it.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. Okay, so one of the central ideas in 19th century philosophy, and this is something that all the thinkers that we're talking about here had to grapple with, Feuerbach, Schopenhauer, also both Wagner and Nietzsche, as well as other thinkers like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. One major problem that all 19th century thinkers had to contend with is the decline of religious belief. and what consequences that has for how we should live our lives. So the question was, do we try to cling to religion in spite of everything? Which I guess that was Kierkegaard's response, the leap of faith, the Kierkegaardian leap of faith. Do we hold on to religious morality even as religion itself is declining, even as religious faith is declining in the face of scientific progress, the discoveries and the achievements of science? People are losing their faith, becoming more skeptical, more free thinking. Do we still try to preserve some aspect of religious morality? Do we reject it and try to come up with a new morality? These are all questions that people in the 19th century and beyond struggled with. And what's particularly interesting here is how here Schopenhauer strikingly differs from his mentor, Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant, at the end of the 18th century, had tried to bring Christian morality back into philosophy through something that he called the categorical imperative, which is basically it's basically a new philosophical interpretation of morality, the essence of morality being obedience to duty, to obedience to moral law, which is one way that Kant describes it in his books, the Foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals, and the second of his critiques, the Critique of Practical Reason. And Kant was criticized for this by both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche as basically, so in his first critique, Kant had basically said we can't know anything about God, freedom, and immortality. And now Kant is, as it were, trying to bring in Christianity through the back door, through this idea of the categorical imperative. Both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche criticized him for this, but for slightly different reasons. Now, the crucial thing about Schopenhauer is that Schopenhauer's morality is based not on duty or obedience to moral law, but on compassion. And in this, Schopenhauer is really taking his cue from certain Indian philosophical ideas, particularly Hindu and Buddhist philosophical ideas, which he openly acknowledged. He openly acknowledged the influence of the Vedas and the Upanishads, which were just beginning to be translated into European languages in Schopenhauer's lifetime. So what I'd like to do now is, first of all, look at a couple of passages from Schopenhauer's book, On the Basis of Morality, and where Schopenhauer talks about this idea of compassion. Let's look at two short clips from this book. First clip. So this is Schopenhauer now. Boundless compassion for all living beings is the surest and most certain guarantee of pure moral conduct and needs no casuistry. Whoever is filled with it will assuredly injure no one, do harm to no one, encroach on no man's rights. He will rather have regard for everyone, forgive everyone, help everyone as far as he can, and all his actions will bear the stamp of justice and loving kindness. On the other hand, if we try to say, this man is virtuous, but he is a stranger to compassion, or he is an unjust and malicious man, yet very compassionate, the contradiction at once leaps to light. In former times, the English plays used to finish with a petition for the king. The old Indian dramas close with these words, may all living beings be delivered from pain. Tastes differ, but in my opinion, there is no more beautiful prayer than this. So I think it's very interesting that even though Schopenhauer was, for all intents and purposes, an atheist himself, just like Feuerbach, Schopenhauer was what you might call a mystical atheist, in the sense that he still believes that religious symbolism, religious ideas can be important in understanding the human condition, in understanding or constructing views of human morality. So even though he criticizes Kant for trying to bring Christianity into morality, Schopenhauer was quite open in his acknowledging his debt to Indian philosophy, to Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, centering it around the idea of compassion as the essence of virtue, as the essence of pure moral conduct. Schopenhauer puts it. The next question deals specifically with the question of animals. So let's read this, because as we'll see in a moment, this has important consequences for Parsifal. There is another proof that the moral incentive disclosed by me is the true one. I mean the fact that animals also are included under its protective aegis. In the other European systems of ethic, no place is found for them. Strange and inexcusable as this may appear, it is asserted that beasts have no rights. The illusion is harbored that our conduct, so far as they are concerned, has no moral significance. Or, as it is put in the language of these codes, that there are no duties to be fulfilled towards animals. Such a view is one of revolting coarseness, a barbarism of the West whose source is Judaism. In philosophy, however, it rests on the assumption, despite all evidence to the contrary, of the radical difference between man and beast. A doctrine which, as is well known, was proclaimed with more trenchant emphasis by Descartes than anyone else. It was indeed the necessary consequence of his mistakes. Now, bear in mind that Descartes had actually practiced vivisection on dogs, I believe it was. So, and now Schopenhauer himself was a great animal lover. He had, you can actually find some funny articles on the internet about Schopenhauer and his poodles. Schopenhauer didn't like people very much. He was a bit of a misanthrope, but he really loved his poodles. Okay, let's have a look at the consequence of this now for certain crucial ideas about Parsifal, the pure fool who is enlightened through compassion. The first little clip this is from the libretto of Parsifal that I want to look at, comes about midway or 2/3 of the way through Act 1. So Parsifal has just made his entrance on the scene by shooting a swan out of the air with the bow and arrow that he himself had made. And this is Gurnemanz is the elderly knight of the Grail. This is Gurnemanz's response to Parsifal. Unprecedented act. You could murder here in the holy forest where tranquil peace surrounded you. Did not the woodland beasts tamely come near and innocently greet you as friends? What did the birds sing to you from the branches? What harm did the faithful swan do to you? Seeking his mate, he flew up to circle with it over the lake and gloriously to hallow the bath. This did not impress you. It but tempted you to a wild, childish shot from your bow. He was pleasing to us. What is he now to you? Here, look, here you struck him, and the blood still congealing, the wings drooping lifeless, the snowy plumage stained dark, the eyes glaring. Do you see his look? And then the stage directions tell us Parsifal has followed Gurnemanz with growing emotion. Now he breaks his bow and hurls his arrows away. So there are a couple of moments in Parsifal where the title character has this epiphany, this revelation, which brings him closer to the idea of compassion. One which comes at the end of Act 1 is where he attends the ceremony of the Grail Knights, the unveiling of the Grail, and he sees the agony of Amfortas. Amfortas is the Grail King. He has to unveil the Grail, and he has this agonizing pain in his side. And as Parsifal is watching this, he sort of sympathetically clutches at his side, and but he doesn't know how to articulate this. He doesn't quite know how to put his experience in words. Now, in Act 2, roughly midway through Act 2, there's this long scene between Parsifal and Kundry, where Kundry has just told Parsifal the story about his mother, how Parsifal's mother died of a broken heart because he had abandoned her. He'd run away, he'd left his mother and gone off into the world seeking whatever. His mother, Herzeleide, had died of a broken heart. And Parsifal here is responding to this. I want to look at two brief passages. First passage, woe is me. Alas, what have I done? Where was I? Mother, sweet dear mother, your son it was who killed you. Fool, blind, blundering fool, where did you wander, forgetting her? Forgetting yourself too, oh dearest beloved mother. And then the second brief clip here is, how could I forget my mother? My mother. Oh, what else have I forgotten? What else? What have I ever remembered yet? Only dull stupidity dwells in me. And then, of course, the crucial moment in the opera, in a way, the climax of the opera, is when Kundry bestows her kiss on Parsifal. And it's at the moment of the kiss that Parsifal puts it all together. His experience with Amfortas in Act 1, his realization of his mother in Act 2. Now it all comes together. Amfortas, the wound, it burns within my heart. Oh, sorrow, fearful sorrow. From the depths of my heart it cries aloud. Oh, oh, most wretched, most pitiable. I saw the wound bleeding, now it bleeds in me. That's a crucial line. Now it bleeds in me. Here Parsifal is literally experiencing compassion, the idea of suffering with another being. In this case, suffering along with Amfortas, in remembering the experience of Amfortas. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is look at some of Nietzsche's response to Parsifal. And I think there's no work by Wagner which was more controversial, more problematic, certainly in Nietzsche's mind, than Parsifal. Now, what's interesting is that when Nietzsche is writing about Parsifal or talking about Parsifal, he tends to focus more on the Christian imagery, like the idea of the cross, the Grail, the fact that Wagner is using Christian imagery or Christian iconography in an opera. Nietzsche attacks that quite a bit. He's very, very critical of that. Nietzsche has virtually nothing to say about the Eastern influences or on Parsifal. He has virtually nothing to say about the Hindu or Buddhist influences on Wagner's thinking, which is quite curious. He does briefly acknowledge Feuerbach, and in one of the passages we're going to look at, Nietzsche actually makes a contrast between Schopenhauer and Feuerbach, which is quite interesting. I think it's the only direct reference to Feuerbach in any of Nietzsche's published writings. So that will be quite interesting. Okay, so let's look now at Nietzsche's published responses to Parsifal, and then we'll look at some of Nietzsche's unpublished responses in his private letters to friends and relatives, and we'll see there's an interesting contrast between the two. So these excerpts that we're going to look at come from two of Nietzsche's later books. These are two of Nietzsche's greatest books, by the way. Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886. On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887. Now, I'm assuming that most people in this audience are familiar with the style of Wagner's libretti, his manner of expressing himself poetically. This particular excerpt here is Nietzsche's parody of the Wagnerian poetic style. Is this still German? Out of a German heart, this torrid screeching, a German body, this self-laceration, German, this priestly affectation, this incense-smelled lurid preaching, German, this plunging, halting, reeling, this sugar-Swedish bim-bam pealing, this nunnish ogling, ave leavening, this whole falsely ecstatic heaven over heavening. Is this still German? Consider, stay, you are perplexed? That which you hear is Rome. Rome's faith without the text. Okay, it makes a little more sense in German, but even in Walter Kaufmann's English translation, you still get the idea what Nietzsche's trying to do here. He's poking fun at Wagner using Wagner's linguistic and poetic mannerisms. Okay, now let's look at some of Nietzsche's criticisms, specific criticisms of Parsifal, but in prose. I'm actually going to look at the second paragraph here, where he's kind of making fun at Parsifal. I should really wish that the Wagnerian Parsifal were intended as a prank, as the epilogue and satyr play, as it were, with which the tragedian Wagner wanted to say farewell in a fitting manner worthy of himself. To us, to himself, and above all to tragedy, with an excessive, sublimely wanton parody on the tragic itself, on all the former horrid earthly seriousness and earthly misery, on the most stupid form, overcome at long last, of the anti-nature of the ascetic ideal. After all, Parsifal is operetta material par excellence. Is Wagner's Parsifal his secretly superior laughter at himself, the triumph of his ultimate artistic freedom, his artistic non plus ultra, Wagner able to laugh at himself? Okay, now that's all pretty scathing. Now this next passage is particularly interesting. Again, this is, as far as I know, the only reference to Feuerbach in Nietzsche's published writings, and it's quite interesting what he says here. We should remember how enthusiastically Wagner once followed in the footsteps of the philosopher Feuerbach. In the 30s and 40s, Feuerbach's slogan of healthy sensuality sounded to Wagner, as to many other Germans, they called themselves the young Germans, like the words of redemption. Had he learned differently in the end? For it seems at last that he finally had the will to teach differently. Did the hatred against life become dominant in him, as in Flaubert? Now, this is one of the most famous criticisms in all of Nietzsche, one of the most famous criticisms of Wagner in all of Nietzsche. For Parsifal is a work of perfidy, of vindictiveness, of a secret attempt to poison the presuppositions of life. A bad work. The preaching of chastity remains an incitement to anti-nature. I despise everyone who does not experience Parsifal as an attempted assassination of basic ethics. Okay, whoa, that's pretty intense. I despise anyone who does not experience Parsifal as an attempted assassination of basic ethics. So to understand what Nietzsche is getting here, we need to understand something about Nietzsche's own philosophy. And of course, Nietzsche was one of the important moral philosophers of his day. Unfortunately for us, Nietzsche's moral philosophy mostly takes the forms of his attacks on other people's moral philosophies, whether Socrates or Jesus or Kant or Schopenhauer or whoever. It can be a little bit difficult to understand what Nietzsche's own specific ethical ideas are. But okay, so Nietzsche, like all philosophers, accepted the idea of religious decline, which particularly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra takes the form of the idea of the death of God. So when in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the title character says, God is dead, what he literally means is not, there was a guy named God and he died. No, he's talking about the decline of religious belief, the deterioration of religious belief over the course of the 19th century. That's really what Nietzsche is addressing himself to here. And so Nietzsche's view is that we should not preserve the old morality, the old Judeo-Christian ethics with its altruistic morality. He says we need a new morality which is pro-life. And in Nietzsche's view, this whole idea of altruism and sacrifice and self-abnegation, it was anti-life. It simply makes life on earth impossible. That's what Nietzsche is getting at when he talks about the assassination of basic ethics. So what Nietzsche believed is we need a new morality which is appropriate to a new kind of human being, an Übermensch, like an Oberman, sometimes translated as Overman, sometimes translated as Superman. The Übermensch. Now, the important thing to understand is that Nietzsche does not think of the Übermensch in Darwinian or biological terms. Rather, he thinks of the Übermensch primarily in moral terms, that the Übermensch is going to be a man of greater vitality, greater health, greater spiritual and physical health than the present day man, than the sickly present day, the nihilists and the Christians and all those kinds of people. And so that's really Nietzsche's framework. Like Nietzsche believed that yes, there's good and bad, there's joys and suffering, and the essence of life is to embrace and love all of it. To love everything in your life, even the pain, even the sorrows, even the sufferings. And of course, this is connected with a very important idea in Nietzsche's philosophy, which he also articulates very clearly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is the idea of the eternal recurrence of the same events. The eternal recurrence of the same events. Now, for Nietzsche, this is a kind of a thought experiment. And Nietzsche's idea here is this. Imagine that if you could live your life over and over again, not a slightly better life, not a different life, not an improved life, the exact same life, down to the smallest detail, down to the last sigh, the last the exact same life. If you could live this same life innumerable times, an infinite number of times, would you be horrified by this or would you embrace it eagerly? And for Nietzsche, the ultimate test of a healthy human being is the idea that you would say yes to life, that you would say yes to living the same life over and over again with all the good and bad, with all the positives and negatives. And in a sense, for Nietzsche, this is the ultimate rejection of Schopenhauer's pessimism. So, and I think this is really central to why there was this growing intellectual divide between these two great men, why they eventually had to part company. Because on the one hand, Wagner started under the influence of Feuerbach's healthy sensuality and moved more and more towards a kind of Schopenhauerian pessimism and self-abnegation and self-sacrifice. Nietzsche, on the other hand, who started off, of course, in a very devout Lutheran family, and then went through a period where he was heavily under the influence of Schopenhauer's philosophy, is actually gradually moving more towards a kind of a Feuerbachian materialism, atheism, but the core of Nietzsche's philosophy, which is this very positive, very earth-focused, very humanistic or human-focused element, that's something which is really quite distinctive. And I think it explains why Nietzsche had such a negative reaction to Wagner's later works, like Parsifal, and also why Wagner had such a negative reaction to Nietzsche's published writings, or those books of Nietzsche which were still published in Wagner's lifetime. Okay, now what I'd like to do next is to look at some of Nietzsche's private sentiments about Parsifal. And here we're going to see there's it's quite jarring when we compare it with what Nietzsche had said publicly about Parsifal. Okay, first of all, let's look at this. This is a letter from Nietzsche to his good friend Peter Gast, who himself was a composer and musician. Here Nietzsche is writing about his experience of hearing some music from Parsifal. When I see you again, I shall tell you exactly what I then understood. Putting aside all irrelevant questions to what end such music can or should serve, and speaking from a purely aesthetic point of view, has Wagner ever written anything better? The supreme psychological perception and precision as regards what can be said, expressed, communicated here, the extreme of concision and directness of form, every nuance of feeling conveyed epigrammatically, a clarity of musical description that reminds us of a shield of consummate workmanship. And finally, an extraordinary sublimity of feeling, something experienced in the very depths of music that does Wagner the highest honor. A synthesis of conditions which to many people, even higher minds, will seem incompatible, of strict coherence, of loftiness in the most startling sense of the word, of a cognizance and a penetration of vision that cuts through the soul as with a knife, of sympathy with what is seen and shown forth. We get something comparable to it in Dante, but nowhere else. Has any painter ever depicted so sorrowful a look of love as Wagner does in the final accents of his prelude, meaning the prelude to Act 1 of Parsifal? So this is an almost uninterrupted hymn of praise of Wagner's music. So we go from Parsifal is a work of perfidy, a bad work, to, has Wagner ever written anything better? And then a few weeks later, Wagner writes the following to his sister, Elizabeth. Again, this is after having listened to the prelude to Parsifal Act 1. I cannot think of it without feeling violently shaken. So elevated was I by it, so deeply moved. It was as if someone were speaking to me again after many years about the problems that disturb me. Naturally, not supplying the answers I would give, but the Christian answer, which after all has been the answer of stronger souls than the last 2 centuries of our era have produced. When listening to this music, one lays Protestantism aside as a misunderstanding. And also, I will not deny it, other really good music, which I have heard at other times and loved, seems as against this a misunderstanding. Okay, so how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of Nietzsche's very negative attitude to Parsifal in his published writings, but his very positive attitude to the music of Parsifal in his private letters? So there are a couple of things that we can say about this. I'd like to begin with a brief story. So earlier this year, I taught a whole course on Goethe's Faust, and one of the assignments that I gave the class was I actually gave the students an excerpt from one of Nietzsche's books where he's very critical of Faust, where he basically makes fun of the story about, it's about this scholar who seduces a poor little seamstress, and what a silly idea for a great German drama. And I asked the class to comment on this and what did Nietzsche mean by this criticism of Goethe's Faust. And one of my students did quite a bit of research and came up with an interesting interpretation. He said that what Nietzsche was really attacking in that particular critique of the Faust idea is not Goethe's Faust itself as a work of literature. He was criticizing the way the Faust idea had become a kind of sacred cow in German culture, that the way Germans were, bowing at the altar of Goethe's Faust and holding it up as the greatest work of literature of the ages. Nietzsche was really attacking that, this sort of parochial quality or this narrow-mindedness of the German reception of Faust rather than the Faust itself. And and it occurred to me that this can be applied to many of Nietzsche's critiques of Wagner, that what Nietzsche is really criticizing is not Wagner, his erstwhile friend, or not even Wagner as a creative artist. He's actually criticizing what Wagner had become a symbol of in German culture. And all the things that we talked about earlier, the ultra nationalism, the xenophobia, the Francophobia, most especially the anti-Semitism, how Wagner and Bayreuth had become a symbol of all these things that were loathsome to Nietzsche. I think he's criticizing that above all. He's criticizing what Wagner had become a symbol of in German culture. And so in a few minutes, I'm going to offer some concluding thoughts on Nietzsche's attitude to Wagner. But before we do that, let's take some more questions, because I think I see there's some more questions in the chat from various people. So Andy, let's turn now to some audience questions.
Sure. Couple questions, several questions here. Deborah Marion, was Wagner skeptical of religion?
Yes, but if you look at all of Wagner's published writings as well as his recorded remarks, remarks recorded by Cosima, his own writings and his letters to friends, he's definitely inconsistent, particularly around the time when he's writing Parsifal. There are certain comments in Wagner's writings that can be construed as pro-Christian or pro-religion, other comments that can be construed as more critical of religion or more skeptical of religion. So I would definitely say that this is one respect in which I think the influence of Feuerbach, the influence of Feuerbach's materialism and atheism on Wagner, essentially never left the composer. He that always remains something at the back of his mind. I think it comes through very clearly, particularly in his portrayal of Wotan in The Ring of the Nibelung, but it also comes through in other passages in the later operas. So, but yeah, again, Wagner was inconsistent. On the one hand, I think that skepticism and that critical attitude towards religion always remains. But at the same time, Wagner was conscious of the fact that many of the people, many of the wealthy Bayreuth supporters, many of the cultural and political elites that he was catering to, particularly with his last opera, uh, probably would have been very Christian, very religious people. And I guess as a way of not alienating them, sometimes Wagner, in his published remarks or other remarks, would adopt a more seemingly pro-religious stance than was probably what he himself actually believed. So essentially, I think he was skeptical and or critical, but he was inconsistent in his expression of that. Okay, next question.
Question from David Dalto, saying this is perhaps not in your wheelhouse, but what is the relationship between Schopenhauer's Der Wille, the will, and Freud's id? Did Freud read Schopenhauer, and for that matter, Wagner?
So I know that Freud was definitely was definitely influenced by Feuerbach. We know that he was influenced by Feuerbach. I'm pretty sure that Freud probably, being very well read and very well educated, I think he was familiar with Schopenhauer. I don't know of a direct connection between Schopenhauer's view of the will and Freud's view of the id. Definitely, Freud read a lot of Nietzsche. In fact, Freud took quite an interest in Nietzsche's final illness, his final descent into madness, and what were the possible causes of it, physiological and otherwise. And now, of course, there is an important use of the word will in Nietzsche's philosophy as well, and that's the idea of the will to power. I think it's interesting that on the one hand, Nietzsche takes an idea from his mentor, Schopenhauer, the idea of the will, but he turns it into something different. Whereas for Schopenhauer, The will was Schopenhauer associated with the will with the drive to self-preservation. Nietzsche, on the other hand, associated the will with a desire for some form of dominance or a desire for some sort of growth, which is not exactly the same as the will to self-preservation or the will to preserve life at any cost. Um, to answer the question as best I can, I do think that Freud's view of the id owes something to Schopenhauer's view of the will and probably something to Nietzsche's view of the will to power. But I don't know enough of Freud's writings to be able to answer that question in detail. But I do know that Freud definitely acknowledged the influence of Feuerbach and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche on his thinking. So, for what it's worth, and certainly Freud was familiar with Wagner's work, but I don't know about any direct influence of Wagner on Freud. So that would be an interesting question to explore at some future time.
Okay. Another question from David Dalto. In your presentation, you've been showing covers from Walter Kaufmann's books. And so David is wondering, is Walter Kaufmann still a good way to read Nietzsche? Do you recommend reading Kaufmann?
My two favorite Nietzsche translators, these were the two great post-war, I mean post-World War II Nietzsche translators were Walter Kaufmann and R.J. Hollingdale. So Walter Kaufmann was a German-born American scholar, a philosopher, a translator of Nietzsche, and R.J. Hollingdale was a British translator and philosopher. I own all of Kaufmann's Nietzsche translations and all of Hollingdale's Nietzsche translations, and I've read them all, and they're all excellent. So I would say either Kaufmann or Hollingdale. They're both very, very good. Two books that I would particularly recommend is published by Penguin Classics. There's a single volume called the Nietzsche Reader, which is excerpts from Hollingdale's translations in a single volume, and they're organized thematically. So all of Nietzsche's comments about religion are in one place, all his comments on morality are in one place, all his comments on the will to power are in one place. If you just want a brief introduction to Nietzsche, I definitely recommend R.J. Hollingdale, a Nietzsche Reader, published by Penguin Classics. The other book that I recommend is The Viking Portable Nietzsche, which is selections from Nietzsche's writings translated by Kaufmann. And again, it's a very convenient one volume format. It has all of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it has excerpts from all of Nietzsche's major published works, as well as excerpts from his letters and some of his journal entries. So those are two books that I highly recommend. But yes, definitely Kaufmann and Hollingdale are my two favorite Nietzsche translations. I own and I've read all of their Nietzsche translations.
Okay. A question from Deborah Marion. Why did Nietzsche say the religious symbols in Wagner's operas were not German? Did Nietzsche want pagan symbols instead or nature symbols?
This is, I think, really similar to a question that somebody asked last time about whether Nietzsche was a pagan. I'm not aware that he was. I'm not aware that Nietzsche would have preferred nature symbols or pagan symbols. So yeah, I think Nietzsche objected to the religious symbolism in Parsifal, but and certainly he was critical of it in his writings. There's one famous quote by Nietzsche where he talks about Wagner falling down broken before the Christian cross. So he was definitely critical of Wagner's use of Christian symbols. But I think at the same time that Nietzsche probably understood why Wagner was using religious symbols. And this, again, is something that's in common between Wagner and Schopenhauer, in that even though they were both not religious in any conventional sense, and they were probably both atheists, they still used religious ideas, religious concepts, religious symbols, and religious images, because after all, religion is part of the common experience of humankind. You know, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, we all have these shared stories, these shared images, these shared symbols. We understand what they mean. And, you know, religion is a major cultural and intellectual force in human existence. And so for Wagner to use these kinds of symbols in his creative work actually makes quite sense as a way of connecting with his audience. I'm sure Nietzsche must have known it, even if he disapproved of it.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah. Along that line, Deborah is also asking, do you know if Nietzsche had a religious funeral?
I I don't know anything about Nietzsche's funeral. So Nietzsche was looked after in his later years. First, he was in an asylum for a while. Then he was looked after by his mother, and then after his mother died, he was looked after by his sister Elizabeth. Now, if I had to guess, I would probably say that because Elizabeth was very religious and very devout. Probably, if she had any say in the matter, she probably would have had a religious funeral for her brother. So that would be my guess, but I haven't really looked into the details of what kind of funeral Nietzsche actually did. But that would have been probably the work of his sister Elizabeth.
Okay. Let's see here. David Dalto is quoting Nietzsche's use of the term healthy sensuality and is wondering, prostitutes and masturbation aside, did he actually get quote unquote laid much, and was his dementia actually secondary to syphilis?
That's one of the common theories that Nietzsche's final illness was a result of some kind of syphilitic infection. Uh, Now it's how he would have gotten it, whether Nietzsche might have visited a brothel sometime in his younger years is difficult to say. So of course we know that Nietzsche never married. He never had any long-term relationship with any woman. The one woman that he really seems to have been attached to, which was Lou Salome, that was in the period 1882 to 1883, prior to the writing of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That didn't end well. She rejected Nietzsche outright. So Nietzsche had generally his experiences with women were very unsuccessful. Um, but yeah, one of the common theories about Nietzsche's final illness is probably that it was brought on by a syphilitic infection, possibly as a result from a visit to a brothel at some point in his early years, maybe when he was in his early 20s, when he was a university student, possibly.
Yeah. Okay. We can save some of the other questions for later if you want to continue.
Okay, well, actually, I need to wrap up because I need to be somewhere soon. So no more. I
Okay.
don't have time for any more questions, but I would actually like to give Nietzsche the final word here, and I'd like to share some final thoughts and share a final quotation. Before I get to the last quotation, I just want to set it up and offer some final thoughts. So we've talked a lot about how Wagner and Nietzsche came to be friends, how they came to be close. We've talked a little bit about the period of their intimacy, and then we've talked quite a bit today about how they gradually grew apart. I'd like to offer some concluding thoughts and some thoughts in summary of all of this. My final impression, based on everything that I've read of Nietzsche and everything I've read about the relationship between these two men, I really do think that Nietzsche loved Wagner, that he really regarded Wagner as the greatest human being that he ever knew personally, as a great intellectual figure, a great cultural figure. Even though there were definitely things about Wagner that he disliked, whether personally or certain ideas that Wagner held or certain friendships that Wagner had with other cultural figures. In spite of all of that, I still think that Nietzsche looked back on his time with Wagner and with the Wagner family very fondly. And one very important thing that we need to keep in mind, and something that Nietzsche talks about in his final book, his quasi-autobiographical Ecce Homo, is that when Nietzsche attacks other cultural figures, whether it's people from the distant past like Socrates and Jesus, or when he's attacking more recent figures like Kant and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche makes this point very emphatically. He only attacks people that he respects. Nietzsche doesn't waste his time on any figure for whom he feels contempt or disdain. When Nietzsche enters the fray, so to speak, he's always seeking a worthy adversary, someone who's really great, something where he really feels like there's something important at stake. I have to take issue with this person because culturally and intellectually, there's something very much at stake. And I think we should view Nietzsche's attacks on Wagner, his published attacks on Wagner in this light. That it's less for Nietzsche. It wasn't an attack of betrayal, but in a way that he was kind of expressing his respect for Wagner, saying this is a major figure, a major cultural figure, a major figure in the history of the German nation. And here are ways that I disagree with him. Here are ways in which he and I are antipodes, and I have to distance myself from him. But I think that respect and that love and that affection was always there. And so, by way of conclusion, I'd like to actually share a couple of lines from Nietzsche's last book, which is Ecce Homo. uh, actually published after Nietzsche's was certainly published after Nietzsche's descent into madness. But for all intents and purposes, this is Nietzsche's last book, and I take it to be Nietzsche's last will and testament and his final word on the subject. And so here's what Nietzsche has to say. Speaking of the recreations of my life, I must say a word to express my gratitude for what has been by far the most profound and cordial recreation of my life. Beyond a doubt, that was my intimate relationship with Richard Wagner. I'd let go cheap the whole rest of my human relationship. I should not want to give away out of my life at any price the days of tription, days of trust, of cheerfulness, of sublime accidents, of profound moments. I do not know what experiences others have had with Wagner. Our sky was never darkened by a single cloud. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. That was another absolutely outstanding talk. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our members did also. So thank you once again. This is something that I'm sure will remain in our memories for quite a long
Yes,
time.
Nicholas, a fabulous talk. Can I send you some questions by email?
Yes, please feel free to send me any questions by email. And if you get any questions from other members, you can also email them to me anytime. So
Excellent.
this
Thank
was a
you.
great pleasure. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you to all our members who signed in. We'll look forward to you attending our next Zoom session on October 18th with Paul Schofield. Thanks again, everybody.